This is 15-Minute Fundamentals, where we interview core contributors within crypto and gain insights into their day-to-day operations. In this episode, we discuss the basics of DeFi Education Fund, a nonprofit organization that explains decentralized finance to policymakers around the world and advocates for policies welcoming of the decentralized financial infrastructure. Over the next 15 minutes, you'll learn the what's, whys, and how's of the DeFi Education Fund and get a great overview about the important role that policy work plays within crypto. Hi, Miller. Welcome to the pod. I'm super excited to have you on. You folks are doing incredibly important work, so it's going to be great to dive into the details behind all of that today.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Just to start, it would be great if you can give an introduction to what the DeFi Education Fund is, and I would love to get the whole origin story.
Yep, sounds good. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Miller Whitehouse-Levine. I run an organization called the DeFi Education Fund. We're a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C., and we do policy advocacy and education with the hope of building a policy environment that's welcoming of DeFi protocols and users. So our goal is to represent protocols which can't represent themselves in DC and other policy-making communities around the world as policymakers think about regulating all aspects of crypto from CeFi institutions to cryptocurrencies, etc. So in those conversations, our mission is to explain to people what DeFi is, how it's different than CeFi and traditional financial institutions, and why we think it has a lot of promise to unleash human flourishing in a really unique way. So we do that through a variety of ways. We do a lot of 101s, just explaining what DeFi is, which is probably the bulk of our interactions with policymakers. We write comment letters. So, for example, regulators propose policies or rules that the public can give feedback on, and we do that. And we also, when appropriate, engage in litigation work. So, for example, right now, we are an amicus, which means a friend of the court in the UkiDAO case, which is a situation in which the CFTC, a U.S. regulator, has sued a DAO for the first time. So all of the above, we're here to make the world safe for DeFi from a policy perspective.
How long have you been around, and what was the event that kind of kickstarted your operations?
Yeah, so we got going in August of 2021, so just over a year and a few months now. And we were originally created via a DAO governance vote. So early last year, a Uniswap DAO governance participant proposed creating and funding a 501c4 that eventually became the DeFi Education Fund to do DeFi policy work. It went through the Uniswap DAO governance process, eventually passed at the middle of last summer, and I was hired and we got going last August 1st.
Awesome. You gave a great overview into the high level of your operations, the problem that you're working to solve on. Then I would love to hear at a more detailed and practical level of what the core problem is that you're working on solving, and probably the whole suite of problems.
From a regulatory and policy perspective, the problem that we're grappling with is that DeFi protocols and cryptocurrency protocols, by extension, operate in a completely different way than traditional financial institutions do. And they are doing that revolutionizing finance, which is a heavily regulated industry. So, traditionally, the playbook, quote unquote, of regulators is to apply regulatory obligations on financial intermediaries like stock exchanges, banks, money services businesses, what have you. Crypto and DeFi renders that whole playbook obsolete in a lot of really fundamental ways, because the entire point is to eliminate those intermediaries from existing at all. And so regulators and policymakers are looking at this space and are, on the one hand, trying to figure out whether they can apply their existing framework as tailored to regulating financial intermediaries to a space without them. And if they can't do that, then what are they going to do? So overall, that's the major challenge is that we're here to help at least educate policymakers about, because if you try and apply regulations designed for financial intermediaries to protocols, number one, it's not going to work, and it could be an effective ban on those protocols or the use of them. So that is the overarching policy challenge. I think right now, from an on-the-ground perspective, our biggest challenge is differentiating CeFi from from DeFi within the crypto markets. If regulators, I think, and policymakers have a general understanding of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency protocols, but the majority of them don't have a good understanding of DeFi protocols yet. And so a lot of the time when policymakers are thinking about, for example, how to regulate crypto exchanges like FTX, they might not have even heard about DeFi or don't understand what DeFi is. And that leads them to either, most of the time, inadvertently capturing DeFi within those regulatory frameworks and applying regulations designed for intermediaries to DeFi protocols, which again is nonsensical, isn't going to work, and could be an effective ban on those protocols in whatever jurisdiction we're talking about. So right now, that, like from a practical, more micro perspective, is our biggest challenge, differentiating CeFi from DeFi and explaining why the fundamental functional differences between the two means that they can't be considered in the same regulatory light.
Extremely important work and also very timely topic, like you mentioned, FTX there. And I know that you are kind of structured very well to start tackling these problems by running a lobbying organization that's like super well versed in DeFi. And on that, I would love to continue on a practical path of what do your lobbying efforts include in practice?
It's really doing that educational work. A lot of the time, there's not a specific bill at issue. We don't even have asks other than, please listen to us try to explain DeFi in 30 minutes or an hour and, understand that there is a thing called DeFi out there and it's different than CeFi. If there's a specific policy at issue, we'll lobby on it. So, for example, we were quite active on the DCCPA, which was a bill that FTX was pushing in DC that did exactly what I described a couple of minutes ago. It created a regulatory framework for centralized exchanges, but the definitions captured DeFi protocols and then, for example, applied custody requirements to DeFi protocols, which doesn't make sense, of course, because DeFi protocols don't take custody of assets. So that, to the extent that there's a specific bill at issue, will directly lobby on the DeFi relevant issues in them.
Great. And then in the beginning, you mentioned DAO being sued and you working with that closely. So how about the legal firepower side of things? What's your role there?
Right now, we're not a party in the UkiDAO matter because we're not a defendant or the defendant that the CFTC purportedly sued, and no defendant has showed up. But the case will have major implications for all of DeFi because a lot of protocols are governed by DAOs in one way or another, governance token holders. And what the CFTC's purported theory of liability in the UkiDAO case is that anyone who had voted a UkiDAO governance token is liable for the protocol's functionality. So that is, a sweeping new policy, in our opinion, that isn't appropriately conveyed via litigation. And what we and others have done is try to make the point that that theory of liability, not only, number one, is appropriately addressed or adjudicated by legislators, which is how corporate liability works in the United States, at least on the state level. And number two, that the vastness of it makes it pretty illogical to employ in this instance, even if it were appropriate to do it via litigation. So that's the larger stakes of the case here. And we are, again, making those points as an amicus, which means we aren't parties to the case, but anyone can file briefs essentially explaining why the case and its potential outcome is important to them. As far as direct litigation is concerned, there's a couple of proposed SEC rulemakings that, depending on whether they are finalized in what form they're finalized, we might have to sue the SEC over. So, for example, the SEC has proposed to expand the definition of exchange to include communication protocol systems, a term that they do not define, but we think could potentially capture DeFi protocols of many varieties and then try to regulate them in the same way as the SEC regulates the New York Stock Exchange. Illogical, won't work, and we think beyond the SEC's statutory authority. So that's the kind of litigation work we are doing now and thinking about doing.
Got it. Now, nothing there is really straightforward. Lots of tough challenges. So I'd love to hear that. What does your team structure look like? So who is working at the DeFi Education Fund and what kind of roles?
So I work on policy. We have two comms folks that help make the case to Congress and communicate what we're doing to DeFi users in the community. We also make grants to other organizations and individuals that are trying or need funding for DeFi policy work. So, for example, we've funded polling around DeFi relevant issues. We've funded individuals to write reports on the case for DeFi. We funded another organization called Fight for the Future, which works on digital rights broadly, but is one of the more focused on DeFi issues here in the US. And so we also have a grants director to manage that whole process. Externally, we have 3 lobbying firms that help us with the lobbying, and then lots of law firms to help us with all of the above and the litigation.
Got it. And then I'd love to better understand this whole DeFi policy ecosystem at the moment. So, in addition to DeFi Education Fund, what kind of parties do you see contributing?
Domestically, there's a few trade associations that have DeFi, or only one, I think, that has DeFi developers as members. And so that trade association called the Blockchain Association has been pretty vocal on DeFi relevant issues, which has been very welcome. Coin Center is focused on protecting developers' rights to publish code generally, be it DeFi or crypto related. And so, for example, on the exchange rulemaking that I just referenced, Coin Center brought up a bunch of First Amendment issues with what the SEC was proposing there. So they are, really the OGs on the crypto lobbying scene and are good friends and kind of the godfathers of the crypto lobby.
Yeah, I also wanted to ask because you mentioned the funding of DeFi policy work through your grants program. So, of course, looking to activate others to also contribute towards these topics. How do you see other industry participants, and of course, including something like Token Terminal, how could we help your mission at DeFi Education Fund?
Well, number one, go to defieducationfund.org and contribute to our work. All of this is quite expensive, but I think quite critical. I can't think of an industry or an ecosystem for which policy is going to be more relevant than DeFi in a lot of ways. I think it is existential to a large extent, more than, again, any other industry I can really think of. For example, if the DCCPA had passed, DeFi would have been effectively banned in the United States. And it's rare that the entire future of technology and industry is at risk from a policy perspective. So, I think that contributing to our work allows us to scale up and do all of this at a larger and more effective scale, not only in the US, but also internationally. MICA, a regulatory framework that passed in Europe recently, is focused on centralized players in the space, but they're going to come back for DeFi in 2026. And we want to be well equipped to represent and protocols and users when that happens. So, please support us.
Then, looking a bit into the future, what are kind of the biggest upcoming milestones on your roadmap?
I think over the next 12, 18 months, building out our international footprint is going to be an important priority. Next Congress in the US starts in January. It's going to be a split Congress. I think it's going to be a 2-year period where Congress really gets up to speed on crypto issues and DeFi issues to prime them in a way that they'll be confident enough to pass a legislative framework for spot market regulation, stablecoin regulation. And so I think it's going to be absolutely critical that we differentiate DeFi from CeFi and custodial businesses in those conversations. It is going to be a split Congress, but I don't think there's going to be any reduced attention on crypto, at least without, outside issues becoming a higher priority for Congress. Congress loves crypto, or at least thinking about crypto and talking about crypto. So we definitely want to be at the table. There's an old saying in Washington that I wholly endorse, which is if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And we certainly don't want DeFi to be on the menu.
That is a very good quote to end on. Thank you so much, Miller, for this great overview of the DeFi Education Fund. You're doing incredibly important work, and I wish you and the team the best of luck.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.